The notice came on a Thursday, which Renata Voss had always believed was the cruelest day of the week. Not Monday, which at least had the decency to announce itself as the start of something hard. Thursday arrived with the pretense of almost being Friday, almost being relief, and then twisted the knife. She was standing at the kitchen sink when she heard the knock, her hands plunged into dishwater that had gone cold 20 minutes ago because she'd been too tired to notice. The apartment smelled of the chicken soup she'd made to stretch 3 days of groceries into 4, and the low sound of her daughter's cartoons drifted from the living room. That tinny, cheerful music that had become the background score of their entire existence in this place. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. She dried her hands on the dish towel tucked into her waistband and opened the door. The building manager, a man named Fowler who wore short-sleeved button-downs regardless of the season and had never once looked her directly in the eyes, held out an envelope. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. She'd been 3 weeks behind on rent, and she'd known for 2 of those 3 weeks that this was coming, had even rehearsed what she might say when it arrived. But now that it was in her hands, the rehearsal dissolved into nothing. 30 days, Fowler said, and turned and walked back down the hallway. Renata stood in the doorway long enough that her daughter, Paisley, appeared at her hip and leaned against her leg the way she did when something felt wrong. Paisley was 6. She had her father's dark eyes and Renata's stubborn chin and a laugh that could rearrange furniture. And she looked up now with that particular expression children get when they've decided not to ask a question because they already sense the answer will be something heavy. "Mommy, we're okay," Renata said. She folded the envelope and tucked it into her pocket and went back to the kitchen to finish the dishes. She did not feel okay. She felt like a woman standing in a field watching a storm build on the horizon, knowing she has nowhere to run and no roof to run to, and understanding with a cold, complete clarity that the storm will not care about any of that. She'd been working 2 jobs since Damon left 18 months ago, the diner on Route 9 5 mornings a week and the laundry service 3 evenings, and it still wasn't enough. It had been almost enough for a while. Almost enough has a way of looking like enough from the outside, she'd discovered, right up until the moment it doesn't. The 30 days passed the way that kind of time always does, both too fast and unbearably long. She looked for other apartments. She called her mother, who lived 3 states away in a double-wide with her second husband, and genuinely could not help, though she cried about it on the phone, which was something. She called the county housing assistance line 4 times and was placed on hold for a total of 3 hours and 11 minutes spread across those 4 calls before anyone picked up. And when someone did, she was told the waiting list was 14 months. She looked into shelters. She looked into storage units. She looked into sleeping in her car, which was a 2009 Civic with a broken heat vent on the passenger side and a check engine light that had been on so long it felt like a feature. She told Paisley they were going on an adventure, moving to something new. Paisley accepted this with the resilient credulity of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to read her mother's face at the specific angle where it broke. The letter arrived on day 26 of the 30, which seemed designed by fate to extract maximum suspense from a situation that had no room left for more. It came in a cream-colored envelope with the return address of a law firm in a town called Hallett, 4 hours north. Renata almost threw it away. She received enough official-looking envelopes in a month to have developed a Pavlovian dread of anything with a formal typeface. But something about the weight of it stopped her. It was the kind of envelope that cost money to make. She opened it at the kitchen table after Paisley was in bed. The letter was 2 pages, single-spaced, and written in the way lawyers write things, which is to say it was simultaneously very precise and almost completely opaque. She read it twice before the meaning settled into something she could hold. A woman named Cora Massen had died. Cora Massen had been, the letter explained, the last surviving member of a family who had owned a property in Hallett County for over 90 years. Cora Massen had left no immediate family. She had, however, left a will, and the will named Renata Voss as the sole heir to the property. Renata read her own name 3 times. She did not know a Cora Massen. She turned the name over and could find no purchase on it, no shelf in her memory where it might have sat. The letter provided a contact number for the executor, a man named Gerald Fitch, and noted that the estate had been waiting for her to come forward for nearly 7 months, that the property was ready to be transferred, and that she should contact the office at her earliest convenience. There was a photograph of the property attached as a separate page, printed in black and white from what appeared to be a county assessor file, and the image showed something that looked less like a house and more like a house's memory. A three-story Victorian structure that might have been magnificent once, that still held in the slope of its roof lines and the width of its porch the ghost of what it had been, but was now clearly suffering from decades of inattention. The windows on the upper floors were dark, and several were broken. The porch sagged on the left side. Ivy had climbed so far up the east wall that it had started on the roof. Renata stared at the photograph for a long time. She thought about the eviction notice in her pocket and the 14-month waiting list and the heat vent that blew cold. She thought about Paisley saying "mommy" and leaning against her leg. She called Gerald Fitch in the morning. He was a man in his 70s who spoke slowly and thoroughly, and who seemed to have arrived at a point in his legal career where urgency was someone else's problem. He told her that Cora Massen had been a woman of 78 who had lived in the Hallett property for the last 40 years of her life, largely alone after her husband's death. He told her that Cora had no children, no nieces or nephews, that her nearest relations had predeceased her. He told her that the will had been specific and deliberate, and that Renata's name had been written in it in Cora's own hand. "I still don't understand why," Renata said. Fitch was quiet for a moment. "Miss Massen was not a woman who explained herself," he said. "In 30 years of handling her affairs, I can tell you she was precise, and she was intentional, and she did not make mistakes. She left you that property because she meant to. Is it livable?" Another pause. Define livable. She drove up the following Saturday with Paisley in the back seat and 2 energy drinks in the cup holder and the creased photograph on the passenger seat, as if she needed a paper reminder of where she was going. Paisley slept most of the way, curled against her car's seat with her mouth slightly open and her small fists tucked under her chin, and Renata drove through the darkening farmland north of the city and tried to arrange her expectations into something reasonable. She failed. Nothing about what she was driving toward was reasonable. Hallett was a town that had made its peace with being small. Main Street had a hardware store, a diner that was open until 2 in the afternoon, a pharmacy, and a barber shop. The surrounding land was agricultural, flat fields giving way to wooded hills as the road climbed north. Gerald Fitch met her at his office, which was above a dry cleaner on the main street, and handed her the deed and 3 keys on a ring, large old-fashioned things that looked like they belonged on a castle. He shook her hand and told her again that Cora had been a specific woman, and then he said, "Careful with the 3rd floor," and she said, "Carefully. Why?" And he said the floorboards had been soft when he'd last been inside, which was some years ago, and she said how many years, and he said she shouldn't worry about that. The property was 8 minutes outside of town on a county road that turned to packed gravel after the first mile. She saw it from a distance first, the top of the tower visible above the tree line, and then the road curved and the whole of it appeared through the gap in the trees, and Paisley, who had woken up somewhere in the last mile and was pressing her nose to the window, said, "Oh." It was not a ruin. That was the first thing Renata registered. She'd been steeling herself for something that had fully surrendered to time, but the Massen house was not surrendered. It was battered and unattended and covered in vines on 2 sides, and the porch was without question compromised, but the bones were right. She could feel it even from the car, the way some structures give off a sense of their own integrity, of materials chosen and fitted with care by someone who was building something meant to last. The house was 3 stories of Victorian Gothic, cream-colored paint that had weathered to a pale yellow gray, with a corner tower on the northeast side that rose a half-story above the main roofline. The windows were intact on the ground floor. The front door was enormous, dark wood, with a fanlight above it that caught the afternoon light and held it. Paisley had her door opened before Renata put the car in park. "Don't run," Renata said. Paisley did not run. She walked very quickly to the porch steps and stopped and looked back at her mother, and then looked up at the house with the expression she got in front of things she found genuinely large, which was reverence and appetite in roughly equal measure. The key to the front door was the oldest of the 3 on the ring, brass gone dark with age, and it turned stiffly, but it turned. The door swung inward with a sound like a held breath being released, and the smell that came out was old wood and dust, and, underneath those things, something else. Something faintly floral, as if the house remembered a time when someone had kept flowers inside. The entry hall was wide enough to be a room itself. The staircase rose from it in a broad, graceful curve, the banister intact, the steps carpeted in something that had once been dark red. On the left was a sitting room that still held furniture, a horsehair sofa, 2 armchairs, a lamp without a shade. On the right was what had been a formal parlor, the fireplace still present, the mantel carved with something Renata couldn't make out from the doorway. Straight ahead, past the staircase, she could see the kitchen, and beyond the kitchen through a window, the long tangled grass of the back garden. "Mommy," Paisley said. She was standing in the center of the entry hall looking up at the ceiling, which was pressed tin, tarnished but whole. "I know," Renata said. "Can we stay here?" Renata had not meant to make any decisions on the first day. She had meant to look around and think carefully and be sensible. But she was a woman with 23 days until eviction and a daughter who was looking at her with those dark, hopeful eyes. And the house, for all its damage and neglect, was standing. "Let's see what we're working with first," she said. They went through the ground floor room by room. The kitchen had not been updated since the 1970s, but the appliances were there and the plumbing worked, which she tested by turning the tap and standing back and then reaching in to hold her hand under. The water that came out brown, then russet, then finally clear. The water pressure was low but present. The furnace in the basement kicked on when she found the thermostat and turned it, which she had not expected. The floors throughout the ground floor were wide plank hardwood, scuffed and dull, but solid underfoot. No give, no rot. The windows in the parlor needed caulking and 2 in the kitchen were cracked, but not broken through. The second floor was rougher. 2 of the 5 bedrooms were fine, needing cleaning and little else. One had a ceiling stain that spread from the window corner, and when she pressed her hand to the plaster above it, it felt soft and the plaster crumbled slightly at her touch. The bathroom had a clawfoot tub and a sink and a toilet that she did not test. The third floor she did not attempt, heeding Fitch's warning about the floorboards, though she stood at the bottom of the 3rd floor stairs and looked up and could see the door at the top was closed. The corner tower had a separate entrance from the 2nd floor landing, a low arched door that opened to a spiral stair, iron, going up. She climbed it and came out in a circular room perhaps 12 feet across, windows on all 4 sides, the glass intact, the view over the fields and the tree line, and the distant water tower of Hallett's Main Street catching the last of the afternoon sun. She stood in that room for a long time without thinking anything specific. When she came back down, Paisley was in the kitchen, having pulled open every cabinet door, and was now making an inventory of what had been left behind. 3 blue plates, 2 cups with no saucers, a cast iron skillet. She left a frying pan, Paisley reported. She did, Renata agreed. They slept that night in the house, which had not been the plan, but became the plan when Renata did the math on driving 4 hours back to an apartment she had 3 weeks left in, and then 4 hours up again to sign paperwork with Fitch. She made up 2 of the 2nd floor bedrooms with the blankets she'd packed in the back of the Civic and told Paisley it was an adventure, and Paisley said she knew. "You already said that," which was true. In the morning she called the diner and the laundry service and arranged her shifts, and then she called her landlord and gave notice, and then she sat in the kitchen of the Massen house and drank the coffee she'd brought in a thermos and listened to the house settle around her, and tried to figure out how much of what she was feeling was hope and how much was fear, and whether those 2 things were, in her current circumstances, actually different. Paisley came downstairs in her socks and sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, "I want to look at the whole house today." Renata said, "There are parts we can't look at yet." "Why?" "Because they're not safe." "Will they be safe later?" "If we fix them, yes." Paisley nodded as if this were a satisfying answer and reached across the table for the thermos lid, which Renata had set down half full of coffee, and smelled it, and put it back with the expression of someone who has concluded that certain things are not for them. The weeks that followed were a particular kind of exhausting that Renata had not known before and would not have been able to describe accurately to anyone who hadn't experienced it. She drove down to the city on Monday mornings and drove back north on Wednesday nights, working her shifts, packing up the apartment in increments, carrying boxes to her car and boxes from her car. Her neighbor Delia, who was 60 and had watched Paisley on and off for 2 years, said she thought Renata had gone crazy, and Renata said possibly, and Delia said, "Well, at least you own the place," and then helped her carry a bookshelf to the Civic. She moved them fully into the Massen house on the 15th day, which gave her 8 days to spare before the eviction date, which was not the kind of margin anyone would choose but was, technically, a margin. She quit the laundry service because the commute to the city no longer made sense. She kept the diner job and found a diner in Hallett that needed a server 3 mornings a week and took that too. There was always something wrong with the house. This was simply the condition of the place, the water pressure that dropped unpredictably, the third-floor door that she'd finally opened on a careful afternoon to find 2 rooms that were both beautiful and thoroughly dangerous, the plaster in the upstairs hall that fell in a chunk the size of a dinner plate one evening for no apparent reason. She learned the house's rhythms the way you learn any difficult and worthwhile thing, by attention and trial and error. She made a list of what needed fixing and numbered the items by priority and worked through the list at the pace her money allowed, which was slow. Paisley, for her part, had taken to the house with the unencumbered enthusiasm of a child who had no prior context for what houses were supposed to be. She had installed herself in the largest of the safe second-floor bedrooms, the one with the window seat and the view of the garden, and had arranged her small possessions in it with the seriousness of a museum curator. She had also begun a systematic exploration of the ground floor that her mother could not entirely discourage, because it was thorough and methodical, and Renata recognized in it something of herself. It was on one of these explorations, a rainy Tuesday afternoon in their 5th week in the house, that Paisley found the door in the cellar. The cellar was accessed through a door in the kitchen that Renata had opened once, looked down into the darkness, smelled the damp, and shut again pending a flashlight and a better day. Renata had not expected Paisley to open it herself, and when she heard her daughter calling from somewhere below the kitchen floor, she came through the door fast and found Paisley on the cellar steps, phone held out in front of her as a flashlight, looking at the far wall. "Paisley, what are you doing?" "Mommy," Paisley said, and her voice had something in it that made Renata come down the rest of the steps quickly. "There's a hand on the wall." She came to stand beside her daughter and looked where she was pointing. The cellar was larger than she'd anticipated, the ceiling low but the footprint matching the full width of the house, stone-walled, with a dirt floor that had settled unevenly over time. The far wall was different from the others. Where the other 3 walls were fieldstone mortared together in the way cellars of that age were built, the far wall was something else. It was smooth. The material was not stone, she thought, stepping closer. Concrete, maybe, or something like it. But the surface had a texture she couldn't quite read in the poor light of Paisley's phone screen. The handprint was at roughly chest height. Not painted on, not scratched in. Set into the material somehow, pressed there when it was still soft, preserved in it when it hardened. A left hand, the fingers slightly spread, the impression deep and deliberate, not accidental. Beside the handprint, incised into the surface with something sharp, were numbers. She leaned close. For digits, and then a dash and 4 more. A date, she thought. 1958, and then 1962. Paisley had her hand raised alongside the impression, not touching, comparing. It was clearly an adult hand. Long-fingered, the palm broad. "Whose is it?" Paisley asked. Renata didn't know. She moved the flashlight across the surface of the wall more carefully. It was not a wall in the ordinary sense she was seeing now. It was a door. The seam was subtle, set flush and mortared to look continuous with the surrounding stonework. But now that she was looking for it, she could see where the panel ended on all 4 sides. It was tall, nearly ceiling height in the low cellar, and wide, perhaps 8 feet, and solid in a way that was different from the solidity of the rest of the cellar. The kind of solid that comes not from age and weight, but from intention. There was no handle, no visible lock, just the smooth surface with the handprint and the dates, and at the lower right corner, so small she nearly missed it, a maker's mark pressed into the material. A double helix of letters around a small emblem, and at its center, the word Voss. Renata stood very still. Her last name. Her name, or rather the name she'd been born with, the name that had been her father's name and before that his father's, a name that was not particularly common, not the kind of name you saw on maker's marks inside the cellars of houses owned by strangers. "Paisley," she said. "Go upstairs and get the good flashlight. The one in the kitchen drawer. The one with the red handle?" "Yes." Paisley went. Renata stood alone in the cellar and held her phone light up to the maker's mark and looked at it for a long time. The emblem in the center was a compass rose. The next morning she called Gerald Fitch. He listened to her describe the cellar wall with more attention than he'd given most of their previous conversations. When she finished, he was quiet long enough that she checked her phone to make sure the call was still connected. "You said Voss," he said. "That's right." He cleared his throat. "Miss Voss, how much do you know about your family on your father's side?" She thought about it. "My father died when I was 12. His family was from somewhere in the north of the state, but I never met most of them. He didn't talk about them much." "Why?" Another silence, longer. "I think you should come to the office. There are some documents that came with the estate that I perhaps should have shown you at the transfer. I had thought they were simply historical, not particularly relevant." She drove into Hallett that afternoon and left Paisley with the neighbor's teenager, a girl named Ash who charged $5 an hour and taught Paisley card games that Renata suspected were not entirely age-appropriate. Fitch's office was cool and orderly, the kind of space that had not changed since the 1980s and saw no reason to. He had a folder on the desk when she arrived, manila, thick, the kind of thickness that suggests not one story but several. He slid it across the desk without preamble. Cora Massen's maiden name, he said, was Cora Massen by marriage. Her birth name was Cora Voss. Renata's hand stopped on the folder. Her father, his name was Conrad Voss. Her grandfather, the man who built the house and the cellar beneath it, his name was Wilhelm Voss. He came to Hallett County in 1919 from Bavaria, which was then, as now, part of Germany, though at the time things were considerably unsettled there. He was an engineer by training and a craftsman by calling, and he built the house himself over 4 years. He built the cellar over a 5th year and a 6th. Conrad, his son, was born in 1940 and inherited the property in 1968 when Wilhelm died. Conrad had 2 children, Cora and a brother named Peter. Peter left for the West Coast in the 1970s and died there in 1991. His son, your father, was named Jacob Voss. Renata sat with this for a moment. Cora was my great-aunt, in effect, and she knew who I was. She researched your family line. I think she had been doing so for some years. She found your father, and after he died, she found you. She chose not to make contact. She told me once that she wanted you to come to the house without expectation, without knowing what might be there. She said foreknowledge was the enemy of discovery. Renata looked down at the folder. "What's in this?" "Documents from Wilhelm, mostly. And from Conrad. Some of it I understand. Some of it, I'll be honest with you, I do not." She opened the folder. The first pages were property records, straightforward, the deed transfers and survey maps she might have expected. Beneath those were photographs, old and carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. A man she didn't know standing in front of the house in what appeared to be the late 1920s, the house. Not yet finished, the frame of it visible behind him. He was tall and had a beard and was looking at the camera with the direct, slightly challenging expression of someone who has survived enough to stop being nervous about most things. She turned the photograph over. "Wilhelm, 1927, the back said. More photographs. Wilhelm at a workbench. Wilhelm with a woman who must have been his wife, both of them in their Sunday best in front of a church. Wilhelm with a young boy, perhaps 6, the boy squinting into the sun and reaching up for his father's hand. Conrad, 1946, the back said. Then letters. 3 of them, in German, which she could not read, though she could see that the handwriting was the same as the labels on the photographs, and that the letters were long and detailed and clearly important. Fitch had them translated, he said, when she looked up. He slid 3 more pages across. The originals are from Wilhelm to Conrad, written in 1958, when Conrad turned 18. The first one is general. The second is about the house. The third one, Fitch said, is about the cellar. She picked up the third translated letter and read it. Wilhelm had written it with the precision of an engineer who understood that some instructions, once given, could not be revised. He began by telling his son that the cellar was not an ordinary cellar, which Conrad had known since childhood without being told why. He told him now. In 1952, having spent 30 years accumulating first knowledge and then materials, Wilhelm had built into the floor of the cellar a vault. Not a safe in the common understanding of the word. A vault, engineered with the same care he had applied to the house above it, perhaps more. It had taken him 4 years to complete. The door was keyed to a mechanism he had designed himself, a handprint reader of a kind that would not become commercially available for another 30 years, using a cast of Wilhelm's own left hand as the template, but the design accommodated family inheritance. Conrad's hand would open it. Conrad's children's hands would open it. The vault had been built for the family, and for whatever came after the family. Renata's hands were not entirely steady by the time she reached the next part of the letter. Wilhelm wrote that the vault contained gold. He was precise about quantities. 812 troy ounces of gold in coin and bar form, accumulated over 30 years of work and saving, converted from paper money during the various economic catastrophes he had observed across his lifetime. He trusted gold, he wrote, in the way that a man who had watched currencies collapse trusted gold, which was absolutely. He had also placed in the vault documents, deeds to a parcel of land in Bavaria that had been in the Voss family since the 1840s, and that might or might not still be actionable, depending on how the various post-war settlements had been applied. He had placed photographs and letters and a family Bible. He had placed tools and seeds, things he thought of as irreplaceable. He had placed, in a sealed case, something he described only as the record, and he told Conrad that Conrad would understand what this meant when he saw it. Then he described the door. The mechanism was not simply a handprint scanner, he wrote. It had been built with a secondary layer. The handprint alone was necessary, but not sufficient. One also needed to know the sequence, which was 7 presses in a specific pattern moving outward from the center of the handprint impression. He described the sequence in the letter with the diagrammatic clarity of an engineering notation, 7 steps numbered and positioned. Conrad had been the only person who could open the vault, he wrote, for as long as Conrad lived. When Conrad died, the task fell to his children. He asked Conrad to pass the sequence to Cora and to Peter and to their children in turn, through the family letter that he would also leave for each of them. The letter from Cora was in the folder too, Fitch said, before she asked. He slid it across. It was short, handwritten, in English, the ink still dark. She had never married. She and Peter had lost touch before he died. The vault had been closed since Conrad's death in 2001, she wrote. She had known the sequence. She had not opened it. She had not felt the right. Somehow, she said, with the property in disrepair and herself too old and too alone to know what to do with what might be inside. She had decided, in the last year of her life, to give the property to the last of the Voss line. She believed Renata would know what to do. She wrote, I hope you are not afraid of old things. Most worthwhile things are old. Renata drove back to the house in the early evening with the folder on the passenger seat beside her and the slow understanding of what she was carrying moving through her in waves. The fields on either side of the county road were going gold in the low light, and the house appeared through the trees the way it always did now. That sudden materialization from obscurity, and she felt the same thing she felt every time she saw it, which was a complicated emotion she hadn't named yet that existed somewhere between astonishment and responsibility. Paisley was in the kitchen when she came in, at the table with Ash, a card game spread between them. Ash looked up with the expression of a 16-year-old who is being paid to be there and is fine with that. Paisley looked up with the expression of someone who has been waiting. Did you find out about the hand? Paisley asked. Renata sat down at the table. She'd thought, on the drive back, about how much to tell Paisley and had arrived at the conclusion she always arrived at, which was that her daughter was 6 and therefore younger than an adult but not unintelligent, and that the truth, delivered simply, was nearly always better than a protective version of it. The hand belonged to your great-great-grandfather, she said. His name was Wilhelm. He built this house. Paisley considered this. Why did he put his hand in the wall? Because behind the wall there's something he wanted to keep safe for his family. For us. What is it? Renata looked at her daughter. We're going to find out tomorrow, she said. I'm going to need your help. Ash left at 7 and Paisley went to bed at 8, and Renata sat in the kitchen until 10 reading the rest of the documents in the folder, learning the family she had never known. The papers were dry in the way documents are dry, dates and transfers and notarized attestations, but underneath them she could feel the shape of lives. Wilhelm, who had come from somewhere unsettled and built something solid. Conrad, who had grown up in this house and eventually grown old in it. Cora, who had lived alone for 40 years with something in the cellar she couldn't bring herself to open. She wondered what that felt like. To know something was there and not be able to go to it. To live above a door you couldn't walk through. She thought about what she'd had in her own pocket 26 days ago, which was an eviction notice. She thought about Delia helping her carry a bookshelf to the car, and about the 14-month waiting list, and about Paisley asking can we stay here in a voice that had nothing to do with adventure. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. Then she folded the papers back into the folder and went to bed. In the morning, she told Paisley to put on her shoes, and Paisley put on her shoes without being asked a second time, which was unusual and suggested that she understood something particular was happening. They went down through the kitchen and down the cellar stairs with the good flashlight, the one with the red handle, and a second one Renata had bought at the hardware store in Hallett the previous week. The cellar was cold and smelled of earth and age, and in the beam of the flashlights the far wall was exactly as it had been, smooth and sealed and waiting. Renata stood in front of the handprint. She held the translated letter in her left hand, the diagram of the sequence reproduced in her own pen on a separate page because she'd redrawn it last night to make sure she had it exactly. She held her right hand up beside the impression and compared. Her hand was smaller than the one preserved in the surface. She put her palm against the impression. The door lit up. It was subtle, barely visible in the flashlight beams, a faint luminescence tracing the outline of the panel from its edges inward, as if the material contained something light-sensitive that had been waiting for the right trigger. Paisley made a small sound that was not quite a word. Renata looked at the diagram. First press, center of the palm, hold for 3 seconds. She pressed. Something deep in the wall clicked, a single clean sound like a tumbler settling. Second press, above and to the left of center, corresponding to the point between the first and second fingers. She pressed. Another click. She worked through the sequence, each press producing its click, the luminescence in the door brightening slightly with each successful step, until she reached the 7th and pressed, and held, and the whole surface pulsed once, briefly, and then the clicks became a series of them, rapid, mechanical, a sequence of locks disengaging in order, and the door moved. It moved inward first, just a few inches, releasing a breath of air that had been sealed inside for 23 years. The smell was strange and not unpleasant, dry and metallic, and underneath it something else, paper perhaps, old ink. Then it swung fully open. The room beyond was perhaps 20 feet by 20 feet, the ceiling low, the walls lined with shelves that had been built in with the same care as the door that sealed them. Renata's flashlight swept across the shelves, and she stood absolutely still and let herself see what she was seeing. The gold was on the lowest shelves, arranged in neat rows. Coins in sealed cases, bars in cloth-wrapped stacks, the whole of it organized with the same methodical exactness as the rest of Wilhelm's work. She had no way to calculate what she was looking at without research and time, but the weight of it was visible, the density and presence of metal that had been waiting here since sometime before Conrad's death, since before she was born, since before her father was born. On the shelves above the gold were boxes, archival cases, folders sealed in ways she would need to open carefully. Documents, she thought. The Bavaria deeds, the family Bible, the other papers Wilhelm had described. On the top shelf, visible even from the doorway, was a sealed case of dark metal, smaller than the others, set slightly apart from the rest with the deliberateness of an object someone wanted found first. That must be the record, she thought. Paisley was standing at the threshold, 1 foot in the cellar and 1 foot in the vault, looking. She was not saying anything. Renata took one step inside, and then another. The floor was poured concrete, smooth, cold. The air held a steadiness that was the product of sealed conditions and deep earth. The temperature barely changed from when Wilhelm had last been in this room. She reached out and touched the cloth wrapping of one of the gold bars, feeling the weight and solidity beneath it. She stood in the vault of a great-great-grandfather she had never met, a man who had built this house with his hands and built this room beneath it with his hands and pressed his hand into the door to carry forward the access to those hands, the specific geometry of them, down through a family that had scattered and diminished and arrived at last at a 31-year-old woman from the city with an eviction notice in her pocket and a daughter who asked good questions. She was crying before she knew she'd started. Not loudly. Not the way she'd cried at the eviction notice or the way she'd cried alone in the car on bad nights these last 18 months. This was something quieter and more complicated, the kind of crying that doesn't have grief at its center but has, instead, the sudden collapse of a particular kind of loneliness. The one that comes from feeling you came from nowhere and belong to no one. She came from here. This house, this room, these careful hands. "Mommy," Paisley said. Renata wiped her face with her sleeve. "Yeah, are you okay?" She looked at her daughter standing in the doorway between the cellar and the vault, the flashlight held at her side, her small face serious in the way it got when she was paying close attention to something important. "I'm okay," Renata said. She meant it the way she'd never quite meant it when she'd said it before. "Come see." Paisley stepped inside. They stood together in the vault in the beams of their two flashlights, looking at the ordered shelves and the sealed cases and the rows of gold that had sat in this room under this house through decades of storms and seasons, waiting for someone to come down the cellar stairs and know the sequence and press a hand to a door. Renata thought about Cora, upstairs, living above this room for 40 years without coming into it. She didn't feel what Cora must have felt, which was perhaps the weight of being alone in something too large to carry. She felt something different. She felt the weight of it. Yes, the sheer enormity of what this room contained and what it meant, but she felt also something structural beneath the weight, something that held. She thought about the letter Cora had written. "I hope you are not afraid of old things." She was not. She had grown up afraid of a great many things, the ordinary fears of a life that had not been easy, but standing in this vault with her daughter beside her and the gold on the shelves and the sealed cases above it, she felt the fear recede. Not vanish. Recede. Make room. She picked up the dark metal case from the top shelf. It was heavier than its size suggested. She carried it to the doorway where the light was better and set it on the cellar floor and looked at it. It was sealed with a simple clasp, the kind that a flat screwdriver or a fingernail could open. She opened it. Inside, nested in cloth that had preserved it through more than 20 years in a sealed room, was a journal. Leather-bound, the pages thick and cream-colored. And beneath the journal, a sealed envelope with a name on it written in the same handwriting as the photographs, in English, in ink that had not faded. The name on the envelope was not Conrad's. It was not Cora's. It was a name she had not seen in any of the documents in Fitch's folder. It was her name. Renata held the envelope in both hands in the cold cellar with her daughter watching and understood that this was not the end of what Wilhelm had left behind. The vault, the gold, the documents, those were the material weight of it. But this was the rest of it. The part that was specifically, deliberately, pointedly hers. She did not open it right away. She was not ready to open it right away. She set it carefully back in the case and stood and looked one more time at the vault and everything in it, and then she looked at Paisley. "We need to call Gerald Fitch," she said. Paisley nodded. And then we need to figure out what this all is," Renata said. "All of it. We need to understand what we have." "But it's ours?" Paisley asked. "Because we're family?" Renata looked at her daughter. "Because we're family," she said. "Yes." They went back upstairs into the kitchen and Renata put the kettle on, and Paisley climbed into her chair at the table, and they sat in the morning light of the kitchen that smelled of old wood and possibility, and the house settled around them the way it always did, those slow creaks and adjustments of a structure that has stood through a great deal and is still standing. And Renata held the dark metal case in her lap and thought about a man named Wilhelm who had come from somewhere unsettled and built something solid and put his hand in the door so that someone, someday, would be able to come home. She called Gerald Fitch at 9. He answered on the second ring. which told her he'd been waiting for it. She described the vault in the same methodical way she'd described the cellar wall the day before, and this time the silence on his end was longer and had a different quality to it, more alert, less contemplative. When she finished, he said that he thought they should involve someone with expertise in estate valuation, particularly for the gold and for any deeded property claims. He also said, carefully, that she should not discuss what she'd found with anyone outside of what was absolutely necessary, at least not until they'd had a chance to assess the legal standing of the assets. She understood what he meant by that. The world did not always receive inherited wealth graciously, particularly wealth that had sat unclaimed for decades in a sealed room, and there were questions that would need answering before answers were offered publicly. She said she understood. She did not mention the envelope with her name on it. After she hung up, she made Paisley scrambled eggs and toast, and while Paisley ate, she went back down to the cellar alone and stood in the vault again in the good flashlight's beam and counted the gold bars. There were 47 of them, each wrapped in the same cloth, each approximately the same size and weight from what she could tell without a scale. The coins were in 4 sealed cases, each labeled in Wilhelm's hand with the year of acquisition and a brief notation about the mint. She photographed everything on her phone, methodically, the way she'd learned to document anything that mattered, receipts and contracts and the condition of apartments when she moved in, the habit of a woman who had learned that memory was not reliable, but photographs were. The document cases above the gold she did not open yet. She would need Fitch or someone better suited to determine how to handle old paper without damaging it. The Bavaria deeds, if they were actionable, were their own separate matter, and she was not equipped to assess that alone. She could see that the cases were labeled in the same system as the coin cases, year and brief notation, and she photographed the labels. She left the vault and pulled the door mostly closed behind her, not sealed, just resting. She would need to understand more about the mechanism before she risked locking herself out of it. Back in the kitchen, Paisley had finished her eggs and was drawing at the table, which was her default occupation when left to herself, a focused and industrious relationship with colored pencils that Renata had always found quietly remarkable. She was drawing the house, not from memory or imagination, but from what she could see through the kitchen window, the east wall with the vine climbing up it, the corner tower above. The proportions were better than most adults would manage. "That's really good," Renata said. Paisley looked at it critically. "The tower is too tall." "That might be because the tower actually is too tall," Renata said. "That was a thing about Victorian architects. They liked towers." Paisley added another cloud above the tower and seemed satisfied. She didn't ask about the vault again. She seemed to understand, with the social intelligence of a child who has spent a great deal of time reading adults, that her mother needed to process something large and would share what was relevant when she was ready to share it. Renata had been thinking, all morning, about the envelope. She had not opened it because she had felt, standing in the cold cellar, that she was not ready for another weight of meaning right on top of the one she'd already received. The vault was one thing. Evidence of a great-great-grandfather who had built and planned and preserved for a family he would never entirely know was one thing. But an envelope with her specific name on it, written by a man who had died decades before she was born, addressed to her, was another kind of thing. It required a different preparation. She thought about Cora's letter, the line she kept returning to. "I hope you are not afraid of old things." Cora had known about the envelope. Cora must have known, if she'd read Wilhelm's instructions, that the record contained something specifically for the heir who would eventually come. And Cora had made the deliberate choice to leave it for Renata rather than open it herself, even in those 40 years of living above it alone. She had left it sealed and intact and named. That kind of restraint, Renata thought, was an act of love she had no prior vocabulary for. By the afternoon she was ready. Paisley was napping. The afternoon light was coming in long through the kitchen windows, and the house was quiet in the way it got between the 2 o'clock sounds and the 4 o'clock ones. Renata went back down to the cellar. She opened the vault door all the way this time, propped it with a chunk of stone from the cellar floor, and brought in both flashlights and the lamp she'd started keeping on the second cellar step. She sat down on the floor of the vault, her back against the shelves of gold, which was not something she'd ever imagined being able to write about her life, and she opened the dark metal case and took out the envelope. The paper was heavy and had survived its decades of storage in good condition. Her name on the front was written in the same careful hand as the photograph labels, but larger, with a formality that suggested Wilhelm had held the pen with intention. On the back, the flap was sealed with wax, dark red, pressed with a simple stamp she didn't recognize. She broke the seal carefully and drew out the pages inside. There were 3 of them. The first was in German and she could not read it, but she could see it was the longest of the 3 and had been written in the same engineering precision as the letter to Conrad that Fitch had translated. The second page was in English, clearly a translation in a different hand, with a note at the top that said, "This translation was made by Conrad Voss in 1960 for the use of those who come after." The third page was short, a single paragraph in Cora's handwriting, a note she'd added at some point after Conrad died. She read the English translation first. Wilhelm had written it in 1958, the same year as the letter to Conrad. But where the Conrad letter was practical, the instructions for the vault and the sequence and the legal structures, this letter was something else. It was addressed to the Voss who comes at the end, which was how he'd phrased it, the Voss who finds this when the others are gone. He wrote that he did not know who that would be or when. He wrote that he hoped it would not be too long, but that he had built the vault to endure, just in case it was. He wrote about why he had built the vault at all. Not because he distrusted banks, though he did, and not because he feared another war, though he feared it, but because he had learned something in his years in Bavaria, and his years crossing, and his years in Hallett County that he wanted to preserve and pass forward. He wrote that money was not wealth, that what he had accumulated in gold and coin was not, at its core, gold and coin. It was time. It was the converted residue of every hour he had worked, every decision he had made carefully instead of carelessly, every purchase he had not made so that another could be made later. The gold represented decades of a life lived with intention, and he wanted that intention to be legible to whoever received it. He wanted the Voss at the end to understand that they had not received a fortune. They had received the distilled evidence of what it meant to work towards something. He wrote, "The house will tell you who we were. The vault will give you what we saved. But what I am giving you in this letter is the only thing I can give you that is truly mine, which is the knowledge that you were thought of, that long before you existed, someone who shared your name sat in a room he built with his hands and thought about you and wanted you to have a better position than the one you started from. I do not know your name. I do not know your face. I do not know what kind of world you are living in or what year it is or what it has cost you to arrive at this door. But I know you are family, and I know that is enough." Renata sat on the floor of the vault for a long time after she finished reading. She read it twice more. Then she read Cora's note, which was 4 sentences. Cora had written, "I read this letter in 1963, the year I found the case in the top shelf. I have never been able to decide whether to open the vault or to wait. I have decided to wait. Whoever you are, Wilhelm was right about you." She sat with both pages in her lap and the lamp making a warm circle around her in the sealed cold room, and felt the particular weight of being known by someone who had never known you, and the strange consolation of it, the way it rearranged something in her chest that had been in the wrong position for a very long time. Then she folded the pages back into the case and stood up, because there was work to do and a daughter upstairs who would be awake from her nap soon, and a Gerald Fitch who needed to be called again, and a house that needed fixing, and a life that needed, for the first time in a long while, to be built in a direction rather than simply maintained against the pressure of circumstances. She carried the case upstairs and set it on the kitchen table. She stood at the window and looked out at the back garden, the long grass and the overgrown beds, and the old apple tree at the far end that had lost most of its shape but was clearly still alive, still putting out branches, still trying. The afternoon light fell across it at an angle that made it look, briefly, like something someone had painted. She thought about Wilhelm in 1919, arriving somewhere new with his training and his intention and the knowledge of what he was building toward. She thought about the years it had taken him to build the house, and then the vault. She thought about the care and the sequence he'd designed, the 7-step press that would carry the access forward through hands that did not yet exist. She put her palm flat on the kitchen window and looked at the garden through the glass. She had 31 years of experience being nobody's family, of answering the question, "Where are you from?" with something vague and approximate, because the true answer was too complicated to give to strangers, of feeling the specific weight of a history that stops at the edge of living memory, that has no photographs on walls and no houses full of furniture and no handprints pressed in cellar doors. She had none of that anymore. Paisley's footsteps came down the stairs, the particular rhythm of them, the one she recognized without needing to look. Her daughter came into the kitchen still half asleep and looked at the dark metal case on the table and then at her mother standing at the window and said, in the direct and unceremonious way she had, "Did you read it?" Renata turned from the window. "Yeah. Was it good?" She looked at her daughter. "It was exactly what it needed to be," she said. Paisley climbed into her chair and reached for her colored pencils. Renata put the kettle on and stood in the kitchen of the house that was hers, in the last of the afternoon light, and let herself understand that something had changed. Not all at once. Not without more work ahead. Not without the appraisers and the lawyers and the slow accounting of what exactly was in the room below them. But changed. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself loudly because it doesn't need to. The kind that simply settles into the structure of things and holds. Gerald Fitch arrived on a Wednesday morning with a man he introduced as Robert Abel, an estate appraiser who worked out of the city and who had driven the 4 hours north with the particular contained excitement of someone who has been told something over the phone that he is professionally obligated not to get excited about until he has seen it with his own eyes. He was in his early 60s, compact and careful in his movements, and he carried a worn leather case that held instruments Renata didn't recognize and a camera with a lens that seemed excessive for the scale of a cellar room. He shook her hand, looked at the house, and then looked at Fitch in a way that communicated something the two of them had apparently already discussed. Fitch had also brought, somewhat to Renata's surprise, a woman named Petra Halls who was an archivist at the State Historical Society. She was tall and wore her gray hair short, and moved through the entry hall of the Massen house with the contained alertness of someone cataloging everything they see. She told Renata, before they even reached the cellar stairs, that the pressed tin ceiling in the entry hall was original to the 1920s construction and was in remarkable condition, and that she hoped Renata would consider having it assessed for historical preservation designation. Renata said she'd look into it. She was still absorbing the reality of having 4 adults in her kitchen. Paisley was at the neighbors for the morning. Renata had made that arrangement deliberately, not because she thought anything would go wrong, but because she wanted to be able to pay full attention to whatever was about to happen, and paying full attention around Paisley required a portion of her mind that she couldn't spare. She led them down the cellar stairs in a line, Fitch first, then Abel, then Petra Halls, then herself with the lamp. The flashlights were already down there, where she'd left them. The vault door stood as she'd left it the previous evening, propped open, the lamp's warmth reaching just inside to show the first row of shelves. Abel stopped in the doorway and stood still for a full 10 seconds before he went in. Then he went in slowly, the way someone enters a room where something sleeping might be. Disturbed. He put his case down on the floor and opened it, and took out a jeweler's loupe and a small instrument that Renata later learned was a portable XRF analyzer, which measured elemental composition without damaging the material being tested, and he went to the first gold bar and unwrapped the cloth from it with the care you'd give something irreplaceable. Fitch stood in the center of the vault and looked at the shelves and did not say anything for a while. Petra Halls went directly to the document cases and crouched in front of them, reading the labels in Wilhelm's hand, and made a sound that was not quite a word but communicated clearly that she was looking at something that interested her professionally. Renata stood near the door and watched. It took Abel 40 minutes to work through a preliminary assessment of the gold alone. He tested 4 bars at random, and all 4 came back consistent with high-purity bullion, the XRF readings close to what he would expect from European production in the mid-20th century. He examined the coin cases with the loupe, identifying pieces from German, Swiss, and American mints spanning from the early 1930s to the late 1950s. He made notes in a small pad and occasionally paused to take photographs. His face throughout this process was professionally neutral in a way that suggested he was working fairly hard to keep it that way. When he stood up and turned to face her, the neutrality had relaxed slightly. He said that he would need to complete a full inventory with proper weighing and documentation before he could give her a formal valuation. He said the preliminary picture was consistent with a collection assembled systematically over several decades by someone with knowledge of precious metals markets and a strong preference for physical assets over paper ones. He said the gold alone, based on current spot pricing, which he quoted to her with a precision that suggested he'd checked it that morning, was likely to come in somewhere between $400,000 and $450,000. Renata said, per bar. Abel looked at her. No. Total. She recalibrated. The number was still not small. Then he said, that's just the gold bars. The coin collection is separate, and coin valuation depends on condition and rarity and the numismatic market, which is different from bullion pricing. He said some of what he'd seen in the cases could be considerably more valuable as collectibles than as raw metal. He wouldn't know until he had time to research the specific pieces. How much more, she asked. He considered this. It's possible you're looking at a coin collection in the range of $2 to $3 million. Possibly more if there are pieces in here I haven't seen yet that turn out to be particularly rare. He paused. I want to be careful about setting expectations before I've done the work. She understood. She said she understood. Petra Halls straightened up from the document cases and turned around. Her expression was the controlled version of Abel's, but with a different register to it. Less the measurement of monetary value and more the recognition of significance that has nothing to do with money. She said that she would need to open the cases very carefully and in a controlled environment. That old paper was sensitive to temperature change and humidity in ways that the vault itself had so far been managing better than she would have predicted for an unsealed storage environment. She said she could see from the labeling that at least 2 of the cases contained documents with a pre-20th century date of origin, which suggested they might be among the items Wilhelm had brought from Bavaria. She said, if there are authentic deeds to Bavarian land in here, that's a legal matter well outside my expertise, but potentially a significant one. Land claims in Bavaria are governed by German inheritance law, and there have been cases in the last 2 decades where pre-war deeds held up in German courts, particularly for properties in certain regions. She said she could refer Renata to an attorney who specialized in cross-border inheritance claims if the documents turned out to be what she suspected. I don't know how to begin thinking about that, Renata said. You don't have to yet, Petra said. First we understand what's actually here. Then we think about what it means. Fitch had been quiet through all of this, standing in the center of the vault with his hands in his pockets. And now he said, there is one more thing. He looked at Renata. You mentioned a sealed envelope with your name on it. A letter from Wilhelm directly. She'd told him about it in their phone call, briefly. She described it without describing the contents, because something in her had needed to hold those contents close for at least a day before offering them to anyone else. Yes, she said. Fitch nodded slowly. Then his voice, which was generally as dry as old paper, shifted into something slightly warmer. He said that in 30 years of executing estates he had encountered a great many documents and a great many provisions and a great many things that people chose to leave behind. He said he had not encountered something quite like this, by which he meant not the vault specifically, but the deliberateness of it. The way Wilhelm had constructed not just a physical storage system, but a communication across time. The letter to Conrad. The record for the Voss at the end. The handprint in the door. He said he thought Cora had been wise to leave it all for Renata to discover intact rather than dismantling it piece by piece in her own lifetime, because the experience of discovering it as a whole was different from receiving an itemized inheritance, and that difference seemed, to him, intentional. Renata thought about that on and off for the rest of the day. Abel spent 4 more hours in the vault, working through the coin cases with the thoroughness of someone who understood that. This was the kind of work that could not be done twice. He inventoried each case, photographing and noting each piece, and when he was done he packed his equipment and told Renata he'd have a preliminary written valuation within 2 weeks. He also gave her the name of an insurance agent he trusted, because he said, now that the existence of the collection was known to several people, the contents of the vault needed to be covered. She wrote down the name. Petra spent her time photographing the labels on the document cases and making notes about the condition of the vault environment, the temperature, the visible humidity, the shelving materials. She told Renata that the cases themselves should not be moved until she could bring proper archival handling equipment, and that in the meantime the vault should be kept closed, and the cellar door should be kept closed, and the temperature in the house should be kept as stable as possible. She said old paper feared change above most things. By the time they all left in the early afternoon, Renata's kitchen felt larger than it had before, the way a room does after it's held more people and purpose than usual. She stood at the sink and drank a glass of water and looked out the window at the back garden. where the afternoon was doing its thing with the light and the overgrown grass. She called Paisley back from the neighbors and made soup for dinner, and said nothing about the morning's events because she was still processing them, and because Paisley, who had spent the morning playing cards with Ash's younger sister, was full of news about the card game and did not require any supplement. That night, after Paisley was asleep, Renata sat at the kitchen table with her phone and looked up current gold spot prices and did arithmetic on a notepad. The arithmetic was not comfortable or easy in the way that arithmetic usually isn't when it produces numbers you haven't previously associated with your own life. She wrote down what Abel had said, 400 to 450,000 for the bars alone, 2 to 3 million potentially for the coins, plus the document cases, the contents of which were unknown, plus whatever the Bavaria deeds might or might not be worth, which was a question with no answer yet. She looked at the number she'd written down at the bottom of her arithmetic. She looked at it for a while. Then she put the notepad face down on the table and went to bed. In the weeks that followed, the house became a place of gradual and methodical revelation. Abel's written valuation arrived and was more detailed and more considered than she'd expected. 14 pages with photographs and market comparisons and a summary that placed the gold bars at $432,000 at current prices and the coin collection, after research, at just under $2.4 million. He noted 4 pieces in particular that were of exceptional rarity, including a 1933 double eagle that he had not initially expected to find in a private collection of this kind and whose presence he described, in the careful language of formal appraisals, as remarkable. He said that piece alone was worth between $6 and $8 million in the current market, and that if it were authentic, and he believed it was, the full coin collection valuation would need to be revised significantly upward. Renata read that paragraph 3 times. She called Abel and asked him to explain the double eagle. He explained it, the history of the coin, the executive order that had required the melting of almost all specimens in 1933, the handful that had survived, the auction records, the legal status of privately held examples. He said he would want a second opinion from a specialist in rare American coinage before he revised his formal valuation. He said she should not tell anyone else about this specific piece until they had confirmed the authentication. She said she understood. She was becoming accustomed to understanding things she had not previously been equipped to understand. Petra Halls returned with a colleague and archival handling equipment on a Tuesday in the 3rd week. They worked in the vault for an entire day with cotton gloves and humidified envelopes and the focused quiet of people whose work required a particular relationship with time and fragility. They opened the document cases one by one and removed and photographed and lightly cataloged the contents with the care of archaeologists at a dig site, which was not entirely an inappropriate analogy for what they were doing. The Bavaria deeds were there, 2 of them, on paper that had held its integrity remarkably well in the sealed conditions of the vault. Petra said the paper was consistent with 19th-century German production, and the seal on both documents appeared to be authentic to the Bavarian land registry of the period. The property described was in a region south of Munich that she said, carefully, had been subject to significant development since the post-war period. She said she was not an attorney and could not say what the deeds were worth in a legal sense. She could say they were authentic documents with a clear chain of custody traceable through the family records also present in the vault. Renata stared at the photographs Petra had taken, the old paper with its formal German script and official seal, and tried to understand that this was real. That beneath this house, in a room her great-great-grandfather had built with his hands, there had been sitting for decades not just gold and coins and letters, but potentially the title to land in Bavaria. She called the attorney Petra had recommended. His name was Marcus Driesch, and he worked out of a firm in the city that specialized in cross-border estate claims. He was a steady, unhurried man who listened to everything she told him without interruption and then said that he would need to see the documents, and that the process of investigating a Bavarian land claim was not fast, but that it was a real process with real legal standing and that he had handled similar cases before and some of them had resolved in the claimant's favor. He said the key factors were the authenticity of the deeds, the traceability of the family line, and whether the property had been expropriated or transferred under duress at any point in the 20th century, which would trigger additional legal frameworks. He said, "How certain are you of your family line?" She said she had a birth certificate, a death certificate for her father, the documents from Fitch connecting her father to Conrad Voss, and the will naming her as heir. She said she could probably produce more with effort. He said that sounded like a sufficient foundation to begin. He said beginning did not mean concluding. He said she should be prepared for this to take time. She said she was familiar with things taking time. Meanwhile, the house required what the house always required, which was work. She was still working her shifts at the Hallett Diner and tracking her finances carefully and making the prioritized repairs on the list she'd made in her first weeks there. The third floor remained off-limits. The ceiling of the problematic second-floor bedroom had been assessed by a contractor named Yates who drove a truck with a ladder rack and arrived on time, and said the damage was from an old roof leak that had been repaired but not finished, meaning the roof was sound, but the plaster above was not, and that fixing it would cost approximately $1,400 in materials and labor. She said she'd call him when she was ready. She said this in her capacity as a woman who was managing the finances of a single-income household with a modest diner wage, not in her capacity as a woman who had a potentially multi-million-dollar coin collection in her cellar. Those two things had not yet merged in her understanding of herself. She was not sure when or whether they would. She paid the contractor $1,400 3 weeks later when she was ready, and he fixed the ceiling, and she stood in the bedroom afterward and looked at the smooth new plaster and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem that had been solved. Paisley had started school in Hallett by then. The school was small, 1 classroom per grade, and her teacher was a woman named Mrs. Aggard who told Renata at their first meeting that Paisley was unusually observant and had an interesting approach to spatial reasoning, which she illustrated with a drawing Paisley had done of the classroom from above, a bird's-eye view with dimensions that were roughly correct. Renata said she'd noticed the spatial thing too and wasn't surprised. Mrs. Aggard said she thought Paisley would do well there. Paisley did do well. She made a friend named Tomas who lived on a farm 3 miles from the house and who had a dog that Paisley talked about with the intensity of someone considering a major life decision. She came home from school most days and went directly to the kitchen table with her colored pencils and drew, and what she drew was frequently the house. Different angles, different times of day, the tower at dusk, the front porch from below, the east wall with the vine at a season when she'd stripped some of it away to show the stone beneath. She was developing a relationship with the house that was, Renata thought, its own kind of inheritance. One evening in their 8th week in the house, Renata was in the sitting room trying to determine whether the horsehair sofa was salvageable or had reached the point of no return when she heard Paisley calling from the second floor. Not the alarmed kind of calling that produced immediate maternal velocity, but the kind that meant she'd found something. She found her daughter in the hallway outside the 3rd floor stairs, looking up. "What?" Renata said. "There's light under the door." Renata looked. Paisley was right. The gap between the base of the 3rd floor door and the floor itself, which Renata had never looked at carefully because she'd been following Fitch's warning about the floorboards and not spending time in the vicinity, showed a thin line of light. Not electric light. Daylight, late afternoon, coming through a window in one of the 3rd floor rooms that had no curtains and was being reached by the sun at this specific time of day, at this specific time of year. "It's just the sun coming through a window," Renata said. "I know," Paisley said, "but there are windows up there. Can we see?" "Not yet," Renata said. "The floors aren't safe." "But they might be safe," Paisley said, with the particular logic of a child who had absorbed the earlier conversation about things being fixed. "If we fix them." Renata looked at the door and the line of light underneath it. She thought about the 3rd floor she'd not yet been on, the 2 rooms she'd seen from the doorway, the damaged floorboards. She thought about what else might be up there in a house that had already produced a vault in its cellar and a letter addressed to her by name. She called Yates the following week. He came and went up the 3rd floor stairs carefully, testing each step, and reported back that the stairs themselves were fine. The floorboards in the first room were compromised along one wall where a window had been broken at some point and rain had come in repeatedly over several years, but the rest of that room was sound. The second room was fully sound, he said. He'd checked it twice. He said the first room could be fixed for around $800 in materials and a day's labor. She told him to schedule it. While she waited for Yates to come back, something else happened. One of her regular customers at the Hallett Diner, a man named Elwood Sears who ate breakfast there on Tuesdays and Thursdays and always had the same thing, eggs over easy and rye toast, had apparently mentioned to someone that the woman who'd moved into the old Massen Place was having work done on it. The someone had apparently mentioned this to someone else, and the chain had continued in the way chains continue in small towns, and the result was that a woman named Patricia Wilhelm knocked on Renata's door on a Saturday morning and introduced herself as the president of the Halleck County Historical Preservation Society. Renata made coffee, and they sat in the kitchen, which was the room in the house she'd made the most habitable, and Patricia Wilhelm looked around with a contained but obvious enthusiasm and said that she'd been hoping someone would take on the Massen house ever since Cora died, that it was a significant example of rural Victorian Gothic architecture with documented provenance back to the original construction, that it had been on the Society's list of properties of interest for 15 years. She said she wanted to know what Renata's intentions were. Renata said she was planning to live here. Patricia Wilhelm seemed prepared for various answers, but not quite for that one. Her expression shifted into something warmer. She asked about the condition of the house, and Renata told her, methodically, what had been fixed and what was outstanding. Patricia nodded and asked about the pressed tin ceiling in the entry hall, and Renata said it was intact, and Patricia said wonderful with a feeling in it. Patricia also told her something she had not expected. She said that the Massen house was referenced in 3 regional historical documents, 2 county histories, and a 1947 survey of notable architectural structures in the area, and that in the 1947 survey, it was described in some detail. She had a copy in her files. The survey noted, among other things, that Wilhelm Voss had built the house between 1919 and 1926, and that the cellar was said, in local accounts of the time, to be of unusual and sophisticated construction for a private residence. The surveyor had apparently not been given access to the cellar itself. He'd noted only what he'd heard secondhand, that Wilhelm had described the cellar as the strongest part of the house, which he'd meant as the highest compliment he knew how to give. Renata thought about that. The strongest part of the house. A man who built everything well and put his best work below the ground where no one would see it unless they knew where to look. After Patricia Wilhelm left, Renata stood in the entry hall and looked up at the pressed tin ceiling and thought about what it meant to build something for reasons other than visibility. Wilhelm had not built the vault to impress anyone. He had built it to last, and to provide, and to communicate across the distance of time. The house above it was also built to last, but it was built to be inhabited and enjoyed and modified by the people who came after. The vault was different. The vault was the truest thing he'd made, the thing he'd put his most careful work into precisely because it would not be seen. Yates came and fixed the first third-floor room and called down to say it was done. Renata went up. The third floor was different from the second in the way that upper stories are often different. The ceiling angle following the slope of the roof, the rooms smaller and more contained, the light coming in from a different angle and carrying a different quality. The fixed room was bright, its broken window replaced with one she'd ordered from the hardware store, the compromised floorboards cut out and replaced with new wood that didn't match the old but was solid underfoot. From its window, she could see the front field and the county road and, in the far distance, the ridge of wooded hills she had come to think of as the north edge of the world from here. The second room's door was closed. She opened it. It was larger than the first, taking up the full northeast corner of the house, the corner tower's interior accessible through an arched opening in its inner wall. The tower room was circular and flooded with light from its 4 windows. The main room itself was darker, its 2 windows looking east and north, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw that it had been used for something other than sleeping. There was a long workbench along the north wall, scarred and stained with oil in the pattern of decades of use. Above the bench were shelves, mostly empty, but not entirely. On the highest shelf, which she needed the step stool she'd brought up to reach, there were several items. 3 leather-bound notebooks of the kind used for engineering drawings, their spines unlabeled. A small wooden case, closed with a simple latch. A roll of drawings held together with twine that had dried and stiffened with age. She brought them down one at a time and laid them on the workbench. The notebooks were Wilhelm's. The drawings were technical, the precise mechanical drawings of an engineer, with measurements notated in both metric and imperial and materials listed in a code she'd have to decode, but the subject matter was clear enough even without decoding. The first notebook was the house, or rather the structural plans for the house. every beam and joint and load calculation laid out with the thoroughness of a man who had no intention of building something that would fail. The second notebook was the cellar and the vault drawings showing the mechanism for the handprint door in a level of detail that was extraordinary, the springs and latches and sensing elements diagrammed with the same precision as the house above it. She could see, looking at these pages, exactly how it worked and exactly how he'd thought it through and exactly how confident he had been in his own engineering. The third notebook was different. It was not drawings of things already built. It was drawings of things not yet built, or things built elsewhere, schematics and measurements for what appeared to be a second vault, smaller than the one in the cellar, with a different access mechanism. At the top of the first page of this notebook, in Wilhelm's careful hand, was a single notation for the next one, if needed. Renata stood at the workbench and looked at that line for a long time. If needed. He had been an engineer to his bones, a man who planned for contingencies, who understood that circumstances changed and that what worked in one generation might need supplementing in the next. He had built the vault. He had also prepared the plans for a second vault in case the first was not enough or not right or the family had grown in ways he hadn't anticipated. She opened the wooden case. Inside, resting on a piece of cloth that had held its shape over decades, was a compass. Brass, the kind a draftsman or a surveyor would use, fitted with a spirit level and marked with degrees in the precise engraving of professional instrument making. On the inside of the case lid was a small card, tacked in place, with 3 words in German. She photographed it and sent the photograph to Petra Halls, who responded within an hour. It says, "Find what's true." Renata put the compass back in its case and stood in the workroom with the notebooks and the drawings and the wooden case and let herself understand that she was still, even now, finding things. That the house was still giving up what it held, patiently and sequentially, as she became ready to receive each piece. She was not ready to assess what any of this meant in a legal or financial sense. She did not yet know whether the third notebook contained plans for something that actually existed somewhere on the property or whether it was purely provisional, a plan for a contingency that had never arisen. She did not yet know the outcome of the Bavarian land claim or the final authentication of the double eagle or the full inventory of the document cases. She had numbers on notepads and attorneys' names and an appraiser's preliminary report and a historical society president who wanted to put a preservation designation on her ceiling. She had more open questions than she'd had in any previous period of her life, and the strange thing was that she did not experience this as the anxiety she would have expected. She experienced it more like the feeling of standing in a large room where the lights are being turned on slowly, one at a time, so that each newly illuminated section becomes visible before the next one. She took the 3 notebooks and the wooden case and the roll of drawings and carried them downstairs carefully, one arm supporting them against her chest, and put them on the kitchen table. Then she went to the cellar and stood in front of the vault door and pressed her palm to the handprint, feeling the warmth of the mechanism, the familiar sequence of pressure points that she had now pressed enough times to do without the diagram. The door opened. The lamp's light fell across the gold bars and the document cases and the shelves Wilhelm had built to last, and Renata stood in the doorway and breathed the cool sealed air and thought about the third notebook upstairs. Plans for a second vault, if needed. She looked at the floor of the vault, the poured concrete, its surface even and unmarked. She looked at the floor for a long time. Then she went back upstairs and opened the third notebook on the kitchen table and found, on the 3rd page, a site diagram. Not a hypothetical site. A specific one, with measurements from the existing house as reference points, a precise set of bearings that corresponded to a location on the property. She looked at the diagram, and then she looked out the kitchen window at the back garden. The apple tree at the far end. The diagram showed a landmark tree at the property's east edge. The measurements placed the second vault, if it existed, 17 feet south of the tree's recorded position at a depth of 6 feet. Renata closed the notebook and sat very still at the kitchen table. She heard Paisley come in the back door, shedding her school bag, and come into the kitchen asking what was for dinner, and Renata said she was thinking soup, and Paisley said soup was good, and sat down and reached for her pencils. Renata looked at her daughter drawing at the kitchen table of the house they lived in, and then she looked at the third notebook, and then she looked out the window at the back garden, and the apple tree at the far end that was already losing its leaves to the early cold. If the second vault existed, it had been there for as long as the first one. 60 years or more, sealed, waiting, holding whatever Wilhelm had decided needed a separate room. She had opened the first vault by pressing her hand to a door. She would need a shovel to find out about the second. She did not go out with a shovel that night, or the next day. She was not someone who acted before she understood, and there was a great deal she did not yet understand. The notebook might be describing plans that were never executed. Wilhelm might have built the second vault and then removed its contents before he died, transferring them to the first. He might have changed his mind entirely. The measurements might be from a different reference point than she was reading them from. She needed to look at the diagram more carefully, with the actual property dimensions in front of her, before she took a single step into the garden with any tool. She also needed to think about what she was doing and why. This was something she'd been doing with increasing deliberateness since the first discovery, this pausing before action. She'd spent a year and a half moving at the pace of necessity, of bills and shifts and eviction notices, and the urgent arithmetic of keeping herself and Paisley housed and fed. She had not had the luxury of pausing before acting, because every pause cost something. Now she was in a situation where acting without understanding could cost more than pausing. She was learning, slowly and imperfectly, a different relationship with time. She took the third notebook to Gerald Fitch on Thursday. She also brought the roll of drawings from Wilhelm's workroom and the other two notebooks, because she had concluded that Fitch should know about everything, that the time for managing information carefully was behind her and the time for working with the full picture was ahead. Fitch looked at the notebooks for a long time. He looked at the site diagram on the third page, and his expression went through several iterations. He asked her if she thought the second vault was real, and she said she didn't know. He said he thought they should find out before they proceeded further with any of the other matters, because if it existed, its contents would need to be incorporated into the estate picture, and the estate picture was already considerably larger and more complex than anything he'd managed in his career. He said this without complaint, in the tone of a man who had decided that remarkable things could happen to reasonable people and that his job was to help those people navigate them. He also said something she had not expected. He said that he had been in contact, at her request, with Marcus Driesch's office regarding the Bavaria deeds, and that Driesch's preliminary research suggested the property described in the deeds was in the Starnberger Sea region south of Munich, a lakeside area that had been subject to considerable development and whose land values reflected that. He said that Driesch had not yet established the current legal ownership of the specific parcels, but that the initial research showed no record of formal expropriation during either the Nazi period or the post-war years. He said this was relevant because it meant the deeds might represent a legitimate claim to land that had simply been sitting outside the family's knowledge, rather than land that had been taken. She asked what the land might be worth if the claim held up. Fitch said that Driesch's office had suggested that undeveloped lakeside land in that region currently sold for amounts that would be significant. He said significant in the careful way of a man who did not want to set an expectation he could not support. He said Driesch would have more specific information in another few weeks. She drove home in the early afternoon and sat in the kitchen and looked at the third notebook and the property deed and the stack of documents that had been accumulating on the corner of her kitchen table and understood that her life had changed in a way that was not yet fully visible, but that was nonetheless complete. The change had happened when she pressed her palm to the vault door and felt the mechanism respond. Everything since then was the long process of understanding what the change meant. She was still working her diner shifts. She went in on Friday morning and made coffee and took orders and carried plates and refilled cups and talked to Elwood Sears about the weather, which had turned cold in the way it turned cold in the northern part of the state, suddenly and without apology. She was good at the work in the way she was good at most things she chose to do, which was completely and without performance. The other servers were women she'd come to like, a younger woman named Becca who had 2 kids in the same school as Paisley, and a woman named June who had been working at the diner since before it was called what it was called and had opinions about everything. June had asked her once, early on, what brought her to Hallett, and Renata had said she'd inherited a property here, and June had said the Massen place, and Renata had said yes, and June had paused over what she was doing, which was folding napkins, and said that Cora Massen had come in here once a week for 20 years for the Tuesday soup special and had always sat at the corner table, and always tipped exactly 15% regardless of service quality, which June described as consistent, if not generous. She said Cora had been a private person, not unfriendly, but not forthcoming. She said there had been talk when she died about what would happen to the house, whether it would be sold to the developer from outside the county who had bought up 3 other properties in the area, and that people had been glad when they heard someone in the family was taking it. Renata had said she was glad too. On Saturday, she called Marcus Dreesch herself, which she had not done before, all previous communication having gone through Fitch. Dreesch answered, and she asked him to explain the Bavaria situation to her directly, not in the summary format that had come through Fitch, but in the full version, what exactly was involved, what the realistic range of outcomes was, and what she personally needed to do to participate in the process. Dreesch appreciated direct questions and answered them directly. He said the property in the deeds covered approximately 4 hectares of land on the eastern shore of Starnberger Sea, which was a large lake in Bavaria, and that comparable land on that lake had sold in recent years for prices in the range of 3 to 6 million euros per hectare, depending on what was on it and what could be built on it. He said 4 hectares of lakeside land in that region, if the claim succeeded, represented a value in the range of 12 to 24 million euros at current market conditions. He said he wanted to be clear that this was a rough range, and that the outcome of any claim was not guaranteed, and that the process would take time and would have costs, and that she should not plan her financial life around a number that had not yet materialized. She wrote the numbers down on her notepad. She looked at them. She said she understood, and she did. She spent Sunday in the garden with a measuring tape and the 3rd notebook. Paisley helped, holding the end of the tape against the apple tree while Renata walked the measurement south, counting paces, and then consulted the diagram. The apple tree was not in the exact position the diagram showed, but it was close enough that the discrepancy was within the range of what 60 years of growth and settling might produce. The point 17 feet south of the tree was in the middle of what had once been a kitchen garden, she thought, the regular mounding of the soil still faintly visible even under decades of grass and time. She stepped on the spot. The ground felt no different from any other part of the garden. She was not sure what she'd expected it to feel like. She looked at Paisley, who was at the apple tree's base examining something in the bark with the intensity she brought to small discoveries. "We might need to dig here," Renata said. Paisley looked up. "Like buried treasure?" "Something like that." Paisley considered this. "Can I help?" Renata said she could help. She ordered a ground-penetrating radar service, which was the kind of thing she had not previously known existed as a service you could order. Fitch, when she called him about the 3rd notebook, had suggested it. He said that before she dug in the garden of a Victorian house, she should confirm there was actually something there, and also confirm she wasn't about to put a shovel through something she didn't want to put a shovel through, by which he meant old pipes or a forgotten well, or, he said carefully, other things that old properties sometimes contained that had been put there by previous owners for various reasons. The GPR company was from the city and arrived on a Wednesday when Paisley was at school. 2 technicians, a man and a woman who seemed like they had done this many times and who explained the equipment to Renata with the patient professionalism of people who understood that their clients didn't usually know what they were looking at. They moved the unit across the garden in a grid pattern, the screen showing the subsurface profile in gradients of color that the woman interpreted to Renata as they went. "There's something here," the woman said, when they reached the area near the apple tree. She pointed to a rectangular density anomaly on the screen, its edges clear and regular in a way that the natural soil profile around it was not. "It's at about 5 to 6 feet depth. Looks like a constructed chamber. Could be a root cellar, old cistern, or something purpose-built." "How large?" The woman studied the screen. "Roughly 10 by 12 feet, she said. "Solid construction. Whatever it is, it's been there a while." Renata looked at the screen and the dense rectangular shape within it, and felt the same feeling she'd felt in the cellar when Paisley had pointed the flashlight at the smooth wall. Not shock exactly. More like a deep recognition, the sensation of something she already half knew becoming confirmed. She thanked the technicians and paid them and stood in the garden after they left, in the cold October air, looking at the spot in the grass where the apple tree's shadow reached in the afternoon. Yates came the following Monday with a small excavator that he said he used for foundation work and fence post removal. He had not asked her what she was looking for. She had told him she had reason to believe there was a structural element below the garden that she wanted to investigate before it affected the foundation, which was not untrue. He had nodded and said he'd bring the right equipment. It took Yates and his helper 2 hours to reach the depth the radar had shown. The soil came up in layers, the modern topsoil and its history of garden use giving way to older fill, and then to clay, and then, at about 4.5 feet, to the first sign of construction. A horizontal surface, pale gray in the dark soil, smooth, that rang slightly when Yates touched it with the edge of the excavator bucket. He stopped the machine and looked at her. "What is that?" Renata climbed down into the excavation, which Yates had made wide enough to work in, and crouched. She cleared the surface with her gloved hands. Concrete, smooth, unmarked, exactly like the vault floor below the house. She cleared a larger area and found the edge of the panel, the same clean seam she recognized from the cellar vault door, and followed it with her fingers. It was a hatch, set flush with the surrounding concrete, accessible from above rather than from the side, and in its center, now that she had cleared the soil from it, she could see the access mechanism. The same design as the cellar door, but oriented for a vertical surface. The same compass rose maker's mark in the lower corner. And in the center, the same handprint impression. She pressed her palm to it. The warmth came, that faint luminescence she had learned to expect. She went through the sequence without the diagram. From memory, 7 presses, and on the 7th the locks disengaged in their rapid mechanical sequence, and the hatch released. It swung upward on its hinges, assisted by a counterweight system she could feel but not see, and cold air rose from the opening below. Yates was standing at the edge of the excavation looking at her with the expression of a man who has done a great many jobs and has just encountered one that is expanding his frame of reference. "You knew that was there," he said. "I thought it might be," she said. She lowered herself through the hatch on the iron rungs she found on its inside edge and descended into the second vault. It was smaller than the first, as the notebook had shown, but the shelving was the same design and the organization was the same methodical system. The lamp she'd brought from the garden shed cast a warm circle. She stood at the base of the rungs and let herself see. The shelves on 3 walls held sealed containers, archival cases like the ones in the cellar vault, but more of them. On the 4th wall there was no shelving. Instead there was a surface she recognized, a second workbench, like the one in Wilhelm's upstairs workroom, but in better condition, with tools laid out on it in an order that suggested they had been placed and not disturbed. Instruments she didn't recognize, some mechanical, some that appeared to be optical. And above the bench, mounted to the wall, a large map. She moved closer. The map was hand-drawn, meticulous, and showed a topographical survey of the region around Starnberger See in Bavaria. On it, in red ink, certain parcels were marked and numbered. Beside each number, a notation in Wilhelm's hand, small and precise, some of which corresponded to the dates and descriptions on the Bavaria deeds. The deeds she had given Driesch covered the lakeside parcels, the ones described in the documents Petra had found. But the map showed more than those parcels. It showed a larger area, with more markings, more notations, a survey that went well beyond the 2 deeds Renata had known about. She stood at the map for a long time, her lamp casting its warm light across the hand-drawn contours of a lakeside landscape she had never seen, annotated by a man she had never met, preserved in a sealed room beneath a garden in a county in upstate New York, waiting for someone with her last name and his blood to come down through the hatch and look. Renata breathed the cold, sealed air of the second vault and thought about Marcus Driesch's careful range, 12 to 24 million euros. She thought about the map above the bench with its additional parcels and additional notations. She thought about the archival cases on the shelves and what they might hold that was different from what the first vault held. She thought about Wilhelm, sitting somewhere with his drawings and his notebooks, deciding that 1 vault was necessary, and then deciding that 2 were more honest about the scale of what he was trying to pass forward. Planning for the next one, if needed, because he was an engineer to his last breath and engineers planned for contingencies. She pulled out her phone and called Gerald Fitch. He answered on the second ring. She said, "The second vault is real." There was a silence. Then he said, "I'll call Marcus Driesch." She said, "Tell him the map in here shows more than 2 parcels." Another silence, this one longer. Then Fitch said, in a voice that had abandoned its usual dryness for something quieter. "Miss Voss, I think you should document everything in that room very carefully before you touch anything else." She said she would. She took out her phone and began with the map. Above her, through the open hatch, she could hear Yates moving around in the excavation, the crunch of his boots on the cold soil, and beyond that the sounds of the October garden, wind in the apple trees' remaining leaves, the distant call of a bird she had learned was common in these fields, the world above going about its afternoon. Paisley would be back from school in an hour and a half. Renata would need to get the hatch closed again before then, or at least make sure Paisley didn't fall in, which was a concern that felt both extremely ordinary and completely surreal given the circumstances. She photographed the map. She photographed the cases on the shelves, their labels, their arrangement. She photographed the tools on the workbench. She photographed the compass rose maker's mark beside the hatch mechanism. She did all of this with the care and thoroughness of a woman who had learned, over the past several weeks, that documentation was not bureaucracy. It was honor. It was the act of saying, this was real, this existed, this mattered. Wilhelm had built 2 vaults. He had built a house above them that was still standing. He had written letters to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren he would never meet. He had pressed his hand into the door so that his hand could be carried forward through time. She was carrying it forward. That was what she was doing, standing in the cold of his second vault with her phone camera, cataloging everything. She was the continuation of something he had begun in a kitchen somewhere in Bavaria or at a workbench in this house. This intention to preserve and to provide and to communicate across the years to someone whose face he could not know but whose need he had understood. When she had photographed everything she needed to photograph for that day, she climbed back up the rungs and emerged into the gray October afternoon. Yates was sitting on the edge of the excavation with a thermos. He offered her some coffee without asking questions, and she took it. They stood in the garden together for a moment, the hatch open in the ground between them, the cold air still rising from it, the apple tree dropping a leaf that drifted down and settled on the concrete surround of the hatch. "I've been doing this kind of work for 22 years, Yates said. He said it the way people say things that are not quite about what they appear to be about. Then he didn't say anything else. Renata handed back his thermos. "I'm going to need the hatch closed and the excavation filled in." She paused. "Carefully. I'd like the ground surface restored as close as possible to what it was." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. She went inside to start dinner before Paisley came home, the phone full of photographs in her pocket and the third notebook on the kitchen table, and the house settling around her in the way it always settled, those slow rhythmic adjustments that she had stopped noticing because they had become familiar, had become the sound of a place that was hers. The archival cases in the second vault took Petra Hall's and her colleague 3 full days to work through. They came on a Thursday and stayed through Saturday, setting up a portable humidified handling station in the kitchen because the weather had turned cold enough that bringing the materials upstairs was preferable to working in the open excavation, and the kitchen table became, for those 3 days, something between a laboratory and a library. Paisley watched from the doorway with the focused stillness of a child who understands she is observing something that requires quiet, and she did not interrupt once, which Renata considered one of the more remarkable things she'd witnessed in 6 years of parenthood. The cases held what Wilhelm had separated from the first vault for reasons that became clear as Petra worked through them. These were not family documents or personal records. They were legal instruments. Deeds, land surveys, notarized agreements, correspondence with Bavarian land authorities, all of it organized chronologically and cross-referenced with the precision of someone who had understood that the value of a document depends entirely on whether anyone can locate it. The map on the second vault wall was the index. Each parcel marked on it corresponded to a case on the shelves, and each case contained the full documentary record for that parcel. Petra counted 11 parcels in total. 2 of them Renata had already known about from the first vault deeds. 9 were new. She sat at the kitchen table on Saturday evening after Petra and her colleague had gone and looked at the inventory Petra had prepared, 11 parcels along the eastern and southern shores of Starnberger Sea, ranging in size from less than a hectare to just over 3. She called Marcus Driesch that evening, which was outside his office hours, and he answered because she had told his assistant when she'd called earlier that it was important. She told him about the 9 additional parcels. He was quiet for long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then he said, 11 total. 11 total, she confirmed. He said he would need the documentation sent to him as soon as possible, and that he was going to consult with his counterpart at a Munich firm he worked with regularly, and that she should not make any public statements about the Bavaria situation until he had a clearer picture of what they were dealing with. He said his initial range of 12 to 24 million for the two parcels would need to be revised substantially. He said substantially in the careful way he had of meaning something much larger than the word itself suggested. She said she understood. She was saying that a great deal lately, and meaning it more each time. After she hung up, she sat in the kitchen long enough that the last of the daylight left the window, and the room went dark around her, and she hadn't turned on the lamp. She was thinking about Wilhelm arriving in Halleck County in 1919 from a place that was then economically shattered, the German mark collapsing in the years that followed, the world reconfiguring in ways that punished people who held paper. She was thinking about a man who had chosen to hold land instead, not the land in front of him where he was building a house, but the land behind him, across the ocean, the land of his family's past, documented and preserved and locked in cases under a garden. He had not been able to go back to it. He had not been able to sell it or use it or derive any practical benefit from it in his own lifetime. He had simply kept the record of it because he understood that the record was what made the thing real, and that someday someone with his name would need that reality to be available to them. She turned on the lamp and made dinner. The winter moved through the house in the way winters move through old houses, not unkindly, but without particular consideration. There were pipes that needed lagging and a gap under the back door that let the cold in and the furnace that was reliable, but old, and that Yates said she should budget to replace within 2 years. She budgeted for it. She continued her diner shifts and paid her bills and fixed the things in the house that needed fixing as she had the money to fix them, which was slower than she would have liked, but faster than she could have managed a year ago. Fitch called in January with news from Abel. The 1933 Double Eagle had been authenticated by a specialist in rare American coinage, a man whose opinion Abel described as the closest thing to definitive the numismatic world produced. The coin was genuine. Its legal status as privately held property was confirmed by an attorney Abel had consulted, falling within the documented exception that applied to a small number of coins with established pre-1933 provenance. The revised valuation for the coin collection, incorporating the Double Eagle at the low end of its estimated auction range, came in at $9.4 million. At the high end, Abel wrote, the collection could achieve 11 to 12 million at a properly conducted auction. Fitch read her these numbers over the phone in his even, thorough way, and when he was done there was a silence, and then he said, "Are you all right?" She said she was fine. She meant it, though fine was not quite the right word. She was something more specific than fine, something that did not have a ready name. She was a woman who had understood for several months that her life was changing and who was now beginning to understand the scale of the change, and the scale was large enough that understanding it was its own kind of work. She told Paisley that night, in simple terms, that the things they had found in the house were worth a lot of money. She said that they would not be poor the way they had been poor. She said this carefully, without numbers, because she had decided early on that Paisley did not need numbers, and that the numbers were not the point anyway. Paisley had looked at her across the kitchen table. Like we don't have to worry about the electricity? Like that, Renata said. Paisley had nodded and returned to her drawing, which that evening was the apple tree from the garden, rendered in winter, its branches bare, its shape against the sky exact and considered. Driesch called in February. He had been in Munich for 2 weeks with his counterpart, and they had engaged a Bavarian land attorney named Hoffman who specialized in exactly this category of claim. Hoffman had spent the 2 weeks researching the 11 parcels, tracing ownership records through the post-war period, identifying what had happened to each one in the decades since Wilhelm left. What had happened to them, it turned out, was considerably less dramatic than what might have happened in different circumstances. Several of the parcels had simply sat on the registry as unclaimed. The German land system required active steps to transfer ownership, and with no family present to take those steps, the land had remained in the Voss name in the registry, accumulating property tax obligations that had gone unpaid, which created a debt situation but not an ownership situation. 3 parcels had been appropriated during the war years by a local authority for wartime use and had subsequently reverted to the registry, their status unresolved. 2 parcels had been the subject of an informal arrangement with a neighboring landowner who had been using them for agricultural purposes since the 1950s without formal lease agreement, which created a use rights complication that Hoffman said was addressable. None of the 11 parcels had been formally sold. None had passed out of Voss ownership through any documented legal transfer. The family had simply not been there to assert the ownership, and the ownership had waited. Driesch said that Hoffman's assessment was that the claim was strong. He said that strong in a legal context meant not guaranteed, but considerably better than uncertain. He said the process would involve filing the claim with the Bavarian Land Authority, resolving the accumulated tax obligations, addressing the use rights situation on the 2 agricultural parcels, and navigating the 3 parcels with the wartime appropriation history, which might require a separate process through a different administrative channel. He said the total process would take time. He used the word years, carefully, as in more than one. She asked him again about the value range for all 11 parcels. He said he had asked Hoffman and a Munich real estate firm to give him a preliminary picture. He said the 11 parcels totaled approximately 14 hectares of lake-adjacent land, not all of it directly on the water, but all of it within what the Munich firm described as the premium corridor of the eastern and southern shore. He said the firm had given a range based on current comparable sales. He paused at this point in the way he paused before something significant. He said the range was between 40 and 60 million euros. She stood in the kitchen with the phone against her ear and the February light coming in through the window onto the floor. She said, "I'll need you to send me that in writing." He said he would. She hung up and looked at the kitchen and the house around it. The pressed tin ceiling, she could hear the faint creak of above the entry hall. The wide plank floors she'd learned to walk across in the dark without making them speak. Outside the window, the garden was snow-covered, the apple tree's bare branches white-edged. 17 feet south of the tree, beneath 6 feet of soil and concrete, Wilhelm's second vault held its cases and its map and its instruments and its decades of careful waiting. She thought about the eviction notice, the blue-gray paper of it, the way Fowler had held it out without looking at her. The way she had stood in the doorway of the apartment that smelled of chicken soup and held it, and already known, somewhere beneath the knowing, that the 30 days were going to require something from her that she hadn't yet had to give. She thought about Paisley saying "we're okay, Mommy," and leaning into her in the way that made the question answer itself. She had not been okay. She had not said so. She had gone back to the dishes and made the soup last and called her mother and been put on hold for 3 hours and done the arithmetic on the notepad and chosen, at some point in those 30 days, not to stop. That choice had not felt like courage when she made it. It had felt like the only available motion. But it had been the right motion, and it had carried her through the door of a house that had been waiting for her before she was born. In March, Abel filed the formal estate valuation with Fitch. The document ran to 22 pages and included the gold bars, the coin collection with the double eagle authenticated and valued separately, preliminary references to the Bavarian land claim as a contingent asset, with a supporting note from Driesch, and a section covering the physical property itself, the house and 12 acres of land in Halleck County. A local real estate appraiser had assessed the house and land at $220,000 in its current condition, with a note that restoration of the structure to full historical integrity could increase that value significantly given the growing market for Victorian properties in the region. The summary at the end of the document gave a current total for the confirmed assets, meaning everything except the Bavaria claim, which remained contingent. It gave the number in a single line. Renata read the line and put the document down on the kitchen table and went and stood at the sink and ran the water cold and held her hands under it. The number was $11.6 million. That was without Bavaria, without the house's potential restoration value, without any appreciation in gold pricing between now and any future sale. The number she was looking at was the floor, the confirmed, documented, authenticated floor of what Wilhelm had built and hidden and addressed to her by name. She picked the document back up and read the summary again. Then she called Gerald Fitch and told him she wanted to understand what the right next steps were, not in terms of the legal processes which were already running, but in terms of how she lived her life going forward. He said that was a question worth taking time with and suggested she also speak with a financial advisor he trusted, a woman in the city named Helen Marsh who worked with inherited estates and understood the particular texture of a financial situation that had changed suddenly and completely. Helen Marsh drove up to Hallett on a Thursday in April. She was methodical and careful, and she had clearly done her homework before arriving, because she arrived knowing the shape of the situation and spent the first part of their meeting not telling Renata things, but asking her questions. What did she want? What mattered to her? What she was afraid of? What she thought Paisley's life should look like? What she thought her own life should look like? Renata found these questions harder to answer than the ones about the vaults and the gold and the Bavaria deeds. She had spent so much of the past years answering the question of what she needed that the question of what she wanted had become unfamiliar terrain. She had wanted things once, had wanted them clearly and with direction. Then the years of insufficient margin had trained her to compress want into need and need into what was achievable, and the gap between those things had slowly filled in until she'd stopped being able to see it clearly. She told Helen Marsh that she wanted to fix the house properly. She said it without embarrassment, knowing it was not the grandest ambition a person could name in possession of $11 million, but knowing also that it was the true one. She had come to the house with an eviction notice in her pocket and a daughter asking if they could stay, and the house had turned out to be something she had not expected it to be, not just shelter, but origin, not just property, but continuity. Fixing it properly was not a small thing. It was what she owed it. She also said she wanted Paisley to know her history, to know Wilhelm's name and Conrad's name and Cora's name, and to understand that she came from somewhere particular, from people who had thought about her before she existed, from a line that had held its intention across a century. She wanted Paisley to grow up knowing that. Helen Marsh wrote things down and nodded, and said she thought those were clear and workable starting points. She also said, gently, that Renata should think about the diner's shifts. Not in the way of suggesting she stop working, she said, but in the way of asking whether her time was best spent there now, given what the next year or two were going to require of her in terms of managing the estate processes and the Bavaria claim and the renovation of the house. Renata thought about June and Becca and Elwood Sears and his eggs over easy. She thought about the particular satisfaction of work done well in a context where well was visible and immediate. She said she'd think about it. She did think about it for several weeks, and in the end she reduced her shifts to 2 mornings a week instead of 5, which she decided was the version of this that felt right. She was not a person who wanted to stop working. She was a person who had always worked and who understood the specific dignity of it, the way it organized time and produced a kind of clarity that other activities didn't replicate. 2 mornings felt like the honest amount. The house renovation began in May. Yates coordinated it, bringing in specialists for the parts that required them, a structural engineer to assess the 3rd floor, a plaster restorer for the damaged ceilings, a roofer who spent a day up there and came down saying the bones were sound, and he'd seen worse maintained with far less excuse. Patricia Wilhelm from the Historical Preservation Society was involved from the beginning, which Renata had invited because Patricia's knowledge of what the house had been made the renovation better. She knew which details were original and which had been added later. She knew what the windows should look like and what the porch hardware was supposed to be and where to find suppliers who still made the pressed tin for the ceiling sections that had been damaged at some point and inadequately patched. Renata made decisions about the house the way she made most decisions, carefully and with reference to what she actually understood rather than what sounded correct. She kept things that were original. She replaced things that were beyond saving with materials that matched. She did not turn the house into a museum piece, because it was not a museum and she and Paisley lived in it, but she let it become more fully what it had been built to be. Paisley's room on the 2nd floor, the one with the window seat, was the first room finished. It still had her drawings pinned above the desk and her colored pencils in the cup on the windowsill and the view of the garden through the glass. It also had new plaster and refinished floors and a radiator that worked properly. Paisley walked into it when it was done and stood in the center of the room and turned slowly and said it's the same. Yes, Renata agreed. But better. Yes. Paisley turned once more and then sat on the window seat and looked out at the garden and the apple tree and said, "Are we going to plant things in the garden this year?" Renata said they were. They planted things in the garden that spring, which overlapped with the first phase of the renovation in a way that made the house feel simultaneously under construction and actively alive. Paisley grew tomatoes and one enormous zucchini that she considered a personal achievement. Renata planted the kitchen bed with herbs and put in a row of flowers along the south wall, that Patricia Wilhelm told her Cora had also planted every year until she was too old to kneel. The summer brought more people through the house than Renata had expected. Driesch came twice to walk her through developments in the Bavaria claim. Abel came once to supervise the careful removal of the coin collection too. A secure facility where it could be properly stored and eventually sold through the auction process he was coordinating. Robert Abel handled the removal himself, case by case, and at the end of the day he shook Renata's hand and said she might hear from him again when the auction was scheduled, that he expected significant interest from collectors and institutions both, and that he hoped she would consider attending if she wanted to. She said she'd think about it. Patricia Wilhelm stopped by regularly enough that Renata started making a second cup of coffee automatically when she heard the car in the driveway. The Historical Preservation Society had applied for a designation for the house and had been successful, which meant certain tax benefits and also a small bronze plaque that Patricia presented to Renata one afternoon with a formality that was both slightly ceremonious and entirely genuine. The plaque said the house had been built by Wilhelm Voss, 1919 to 1926, and was listed on the Halleck County Historical Register. Renata put it beside the front door, where it was the first thing a person saw when they arrived. In September, more than a year after she had driven north on the county road for the first time with the photograph on the passenger seat and Paisley asleep in the back, the Bavaria claim produced its first concrete result. Hoffman had resolved the tax situation on 7 of the 11 parcels, negotiating a settlement with the Bavarian Land Authority that acknowledged the decades of unpaid obligations while recognizing the extenuating circumstances of the family's displacement. The settlement amount was substantial but manageable against the projected value of the land. The use rights situation on the 2 agricultural parcels had been addressed through a formal lease agreement with the neighboring landowner, who had, Hoffman said, received the development with more equanimity than might have been expected, perhaps because Hoffman was good at his job. The formal ownership of the 7 resolved parcels was transferred to Renata Voss in a document that came from the Bavarian Land Authority and that Driesch brought to her in person, which she appreciated because she would not have known what she was looking at otherwise. He explained each page and what it meant, and at the end he said that the remaining 4 parcels, the 3 with the wartime appropriation history, and one whose ownership chain had a gap that required additional research, were still in process. He said he expected them to resolve within another year, possibly 2. She held the documents for the 7 parcels and thought about Wilhelm, who had held their predecessors in whatever apartment or room he'd had before he crossed the ocean, who had understood that land was what held when everything else moved. He had not been wrong. The land had held for a century, while currencies collapsed and wars were fought, and the world reorganized itself around new arrangements of power and geography. The land had held, and now it was hers. She called Paisley in from the garden, where she was doing something with a stick and the apple tree that did not appear to require adult supervision, and showed her the documents. She explained in the simplest terms available what they meant. Paisley looked at the documents and then at her mother. "We own part of Bavaria?" "We own part of Bavaria." Paisley considered this for a moment. "Can we go see it?" Renata had been thinking about this. She had looked at photographs of the Starnberger Sea region, the lake and the hills around it, and the particular quality of light over alpine water that came through even in photographs taken by strangers. She had felt, looking at those photographs, something she had not expected to feel, which was recognition. Not of the place itself, which she had never seen, but of the impulse that had led Wilhelm to preserve it. The impulse to hold on to something beautiful. To say this matters enough to keep. She said yes. "We'll go see it." They went in October, when Paisley's school had a break and when Renata had arranged the trip carefully with Driesch's office so that Hoffman could meet them and show them the properties in person. They flew into Munich and drove south into the hills and arrived at Starnberger Sea in the late afternoon of the second day. The lake was large and still in the October light, the Alps visible on the far shore, the water a color she had no good word for. They drove along the eastern shore, and Hoffman, who was a precise man in his 50s who had adjusted to having clients who arrived with a 6-year-old child, pointed out each parcel as they passed. Some were wooded, the trees going to autumn color in the way trees did there, vivid and temporary. Some were cleared and ran down to the water's edge. 2 of the lakeside parcels had old structures on them, small stone buildings that had been used for various purposes over the decades, but that were, Hoffman said, technically on Renata's land, and therefore hers to determine what to do with. Paisley stood at the edge of the lake on the largest parcel. The one Hoffman said was 3 hectares and ran from the road down to the water, and threw a flat stone and watched it skip twice. She looked at her mother. This is ours. This is ours. Paisley threw another stone. It skipped 3 times. They spent 2 days by the lake. Renata walked each parcel she had access to with Hoffman, understanding the land through her feet in the way that photographs had not allowed her to understand it. She stood on the shore and looked south toward the Alps and thought about Wilhelm standing somewhere in this landscape in an earlier decade, deciding to document it, to preserve the record of it, to carry that record across an ocean and put it in a sealed room under a garden. She thought about what Cora had written. I hope you are not afraid of old things. She was not afraid. Standing at the edge of a Bavarian lake with her daughter throwing stones and the Alps blue-white in the distance and the document of her ownership in Hoffman's file, she was not afraid of any of the things she had been afraid of in the apartment with the eviction notice. The fear had not gone away exactly. It had been given a different context. It sat differently in her now, manageable, proportionate, no longer the ambient condition of her existence, but a feeling she recognized and could locate when it appeared. On the last morning by the lake, Paisley found a smooth, flat stone on the shore and held it out to her mother. It had a natural vein of white quartz running through it, a clean, unbroken line. She said, for the collection. They did not have a collection. Renata said this. We can start one, Paisley said. Renata took the stone. It was cold from the lake water and heavier than it looked. She put it in her jacket pocket and felt it there, a particular weight, small and real. They flew home and came back to the house in Halleck County in the dark of an October evening, tired from travel, and Renata turned on the kitchen light, and the house looked exactly as they had left it, the colored pencils on the table, the herbs on the windowsill, the third notebook still in its place on the shelf where she'd put it after the excavation. The house that had stood since 1926 without needing them, and that now needed them in the specific way that houses need the people who live in them, the daily occupation, the accumulated small adjustments, the presence that turns a structure into a home. Paisley went upstairs without being asked and came back down in her pajamas and sat at the kitchen table with her pencils. Renata made tea and stood at the window looking at the October garden, the apple tree dark against the sky. She thought about the number Driesch had given her for all 11 parcels, 40 to 60 million euros, and the confirmed 11.6 million in the United States, and the Bavaria deeds, and the second vault, and the letters in Wilhelm's hand, and the handprint in the cellar door. She thought about all of it the way she had learned to think about large things, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece held and turned and put down before the next one was picked up. She thought about what she wanted to do with what she had. Helen Marsh's question, asked in April, was still the right question. She had more answer for it now than she'd had then. She wanted the house to be what it had been built to be. That was already happening. She wanted Paisley to know where she came from. That was already happening. She wanted to do something with what remained, with the portion of the inheritance that exceeded what she and Paisley needed to live well in this house and in this life, something that had weight and direction. She thought about Cora, who had lived alone in this house for 40 years with the vault below her and the knowledge of what it held, and had chosen, in the end, to give it to someone she had never met because she believed that person would know what to do. Cora had trusted her before she existed. Wilhelm had trusted her before Cora existed. The trust had moved forward through generations like the family line itself, through absences and distances and decades of not knowing what was on the other end of it. She picked up the stone from the lake. The quartz vein was smooth under her thumb. She called Gerald Fitch in the morning while Paisley was at school. She told him she wanted to establish a foundation. She'd been thinking about the structure of it, and she had a general shape in mind, a foundation that would use a portion of the estate to fund housing assistance for families in exactly the situation she had been in, not a waiting list, but direct and immediate help, the kind that stopped evictions rather than followed them. She said she wanted it named for Wilhelm and Cora Voss. She said she wanted it to be operational within a year. Fitch was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was not hesitating but thinking. Then he said he thought that was a straightforward thing to structure legally, and that he would begin drafting the documentation. He said the thing he wanted to say, which he said in the same dry, even voice he used for everything. was that it had been the most interesting year of his career in 30 years of practice, and that he was grateful, which was not a thing he normally said, but he wanted to say it. She thanked him. She stood at the kitchen window after the call and looked at the garden and the apple tree and the spot in the grass, recovered now, where Yates had filled in the excavation. The ground there looked like any other part of the garden, just ground, level and ordinary, holding what it held. She thought about Wilhelm pressing his hand into the door of a vault he'd built for a family not yet born. The intention in that press, the trust, the understanding that the gesture was the message and the message was that someone had thought of her, that she had not come from nowhere, that the ground beneath her had been prepared. She put her hand flat on the kitchen window, palm against the glass, and looked out at the house's land in the October light. The fields and the tree-line and the distant hills and the garden with its apple tree and its covered secrets. The house behind her with its pressed tin ceiling and its tower and its 3 floors of careful craftsmanship. The cellar below with the vault door standing the way it had stood since 1952. Not locked now, but not abandoned either. Held in the same shape it had always held by the mechanism Wilhelm had built to last. She was the Voss at the end, the one the letter had been written for. She had come late, and by accident, and by the particular sequence of small decisions and coincidences that had led her to open a cream-colored envelope instead of throwing it away, to drive north instead of calling the housing line one more time, to go down the cellar stairs because her daughter had pointed a flashlight at a wall and asked a question. She had pressed her hand to the door, and it had known her. She had not come from nowhere. She had not come from nothing. She had come from this house and this land and this line of people who had held things carefully and passed them forward and believed, without evidence, but not without reason, that someone would eventually come who would know what to do with what they'd kept. Paisley came home from school at 3:15. She dropped her bag at the back door and came into the kitchen and sat at the table and reached for her pencils and said, without looking up, "What did you do today?" Renata said she'd called Fitch about the foundation. Paisley selected a pencil. The dark blue one. Is that the thing for people who need houses? That's the one. Good, Paisley said. She began to draw. Renata stood at the counter and watched her daughter's hand move across the paper, sure and unhurried, laying down the first lines of whatever she was making. Outside the window, the October afternoon was holding its light as long as it could, the way October afternoons did this far north, the gold of it particular and brief. The house settled around them in its familiar way, those slow creaks and adjustments of a structure that knows the weight it carries. It was a good weight. It had always been meant to be carried. And they were the ones who had come to carry it, a woman and her daughter, arriving by accident into something that had been waiting for exactly them. In a house at the end of a gravel road in a county most people pass through without stopping, built by hands that had pressed themselves into the stone so that other hands, arriving late, arriving last, arriving precisely when they needed to, would know they were home. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.